Chapter 23 The Abandoned Northern Mine. Yunobo's arm was still burning, not fire, but that nerve burning that had followed him punching the Lizalfos off his forearm. And oh man, were there still teeth stuck in his arm? And hadn't abated at all. Weird how that was the thing that was bothering him most, considering. Weird how he was able to think about it at all, really. He had no idea how many Lizalfos were on the outside of Dirk's protection, which was definitely earning its name today, trying to get in, trying to cut through it with their jagged swords or pierce it with fire arrows launched from their bone-carved bows, or simply trying to cook it by belching fire at it. He knew there were too many, but he couldn't take time to count them, because the one that was inside the barrier with him was doing its best to tear him apart.
Come on. Can't we talk about this? I feel like neither of us is getting anything here.
With one hand he had his neck pinned to the ground, the other arm he used to protect his face as it clawed and hissed and lashed at him with its barbed tongue. It was writhing, trying to slip from between his fingers, but if he was strong in no other way, then Yunobo was confident he had a decent grip. Well, he hoped he did, because if he didn't, then this thing was going to go for his eyes. Actually, it might already be going for his eyes, and just couldn't reach them yet. Had it clawed up in the part of his arm specifically covering his eyes? He couldn't tell. That whole area was bleeding. Just about the only thing he could take solace in was that it hadn't tried to bite him anymore, owing to all the missing teeth.
Okay. It's okay. Just think about this. Breathe. If you breathe, and you think, you can.
The Lizalfos hissed and dug its claw into his wrist, twisting with all the strength of its shoulders, and he could feel the skin tearing like paper. He had to try very hard not to scream. Screaming wouldn't help. It certainly wouldn't make this thing stop trying to kill him, or any of its friends. In the back of his mind, Yunobo was reasonably certain that he was going to die. He didn't have any weapons to fight with, and why had he thought it would be a good idea to come to the northern mine without any weapons? There were monsters. Monsters with the entire reason it had been abandoned. They'd even started calling it the abandoned northern mine, to reference its abandonment due to monsters. And now he was stuck here, stuck inside an impenetrable shield with a monster that very plainly wanted to kill him, surrounded by a lot more that wanted to kill him, and he had no way out. What was he supposed to do? Wait for rescue? Even if he was visible from where Drac was standing, it would take the god most of a day to figure out anything was wrong, and then hours more before he decided whether to run for help. But he couldn't drop the shield. The Lizalfos were everywhere, and they would, definitely, kill him. So, he'd wait, and hope the Lizalfos didn't break his grip. He'd been like this for the better part of an hour already. How long could he go without sleeping? Or eating? Or just cramping even? Oh man, was he getting a cramp now? His thumb was twitching really badly. He could feel it all the way down in his wrist. And if it started in his wrist, then pretty soon it'd be in his forearm. And there was an explosion of sound and vapor outside of the barrier, and he screamed in surprise and panic as the Lizalfos turned in unison. He couldn't see over them, but he saw them gesturing with their swords, hopping up and down, heard them hissing frustration and some new anger. Oh man, I hope nobody just wandered into this mess, so please let nobody else be in any trouble because I am so weak. A wave of air rolled past. So cold it left a layer of frost on the outside of Dirk's protection, so cold that as a body each of the 5 Lizalfos screamed, momentarily frozen in looks of shock, and then exploded into vapor. Their weapons clattered to the stone, the heat of the mountain stripping the ice from them and leaving them steaming.
Excuse me.
He could barely make out the words over the sounds of the roiling lava and the Lizalfos, which was now fighting much harder, but that was definitely a voice. Hylian voice.
Are you alright? In there? We saw the commotion and came as quickly as we could. I'm sorry. Hold on, I can't really hear. Just a second.
Dirk's protection was kept up not by an effort of his body, though it was linked to his physical endurance, but by an effort of his will. He closed his eyes, concentrating, and focused on the feeling of the barrier, solid, more solid by far than his own body or even the stone of the mountain, a shield that separated and protected him from almost any danger. Bringing it down was always difficult, even if he was safe, but in this case, he barely had to concentrate at all before it winked out and disappeared. The Lizalfos on the ground was still hissing, still clawing, but with the barrier gone, the echo of its voice wasn't so deafening. He finally looked at his rescuer, well, Rescuers, two Hylian women, one with blonde hair and wearing the Flamebreaker armor, the other with silver hair and wearing shaky garb. Save the Flamebreaker boots, which she looked very uncomfortable in. The woman in the full set was holding a small blue object that looked as cold as anything he'd ever even heard stories about. Was that a magic rod? Something like the Wizrobes carried.
Oh, wow. You really saved my life. Thank you so much. I would have been done for if you hadn't shown up. The
Lizalfos kicked at his face, which he only barely warded off with his arm.
Listen, I'm really sorry, since you just got done saving my life and all, but could you help me again, Goro? I don't have any weapons to fight this thing with, and...
The women looked at Yunobo, at the wounds on his arms, and then at each other. The silver-haired one drew a bow from her back, and an ice arrow from her quiver.
Be very still.
Oh, that he could do. The words were barely out of her mouth when he stopped moving altogether, holding as still and rigid as the stone faces overlooking Goron City. Even his arm. Even his fingers. Even while the Lizalfos was struggling, and actually it had renewed its efforts as soon as it saw the two women, and the muscle running from the base of his wrist all the way up to his elbow was starting to seize. Okay, maybe he couldn't hold perfectly still, but if he tried then... The cramp struck at exactly the wrong moment, and the Lizalfos twisted out of his grip. It was on all fours, hissing, already lunging for the two women who had saved his life, and he had this terrible image of it sinking its broken, jagged teeth into one of them, and he swung his free fist with all his strength. Crunch. The Lizalfos' horn broke off and went spinning through the air as the Lizalfos exploded into dark-colored, foul-smelling vapor, and his fist collided with the ground. And, yes, now that he was looking at it, his arm did have broken teeth embedded in the skin. The sound of the horn clattering on the ground was even louder than the weapons had been.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I couldn't hold it and it was going to attack you and I panicked. Are you okay? Oh man, after everything you did, We're fine.
The woman with the golden hair cut him off, smiling, trying to reassure him but also putting up her hands to let him know he needed to stop. Oh, he knew that signal. Bluto liked that one a lot when he was scared of something.
I promise. We're fine. We have sustained no injury at all. Are you Nobu? Bluto sent us to look for you. Boss sent you after me? I haven't even gotten his medicine yet. He must be worried sick.
I wouldn't say worried sick, the blonde woman said.
My name is Elda, and my companion is Paya. It's a pleasure to meet you.
The silver-haired woman, Paya, nodded, and Zelda continued.
May I look at your arm, please? I would like to treat your injuries, if possible.
She didn't wait for him to extend it, exactly. She took it in her hands and pulled it, found it much heavier than she had anticipated, and then hoisted it up so his hand rested on her shoulder.
Turn your elbow so you can keep your arm straight but relaxed. Good.
She reached forward, touching one of the long teeth embedded in Yunobo's skin.
DSS.
He winced, shutting his eyes and turning his head away. He did not like this at all, but even that realization didn't stem the tide of sudden shame. Come on, Yunobo, don't act so cowardly in front of the people who just saved your life, but of course he couldn't help it.
Fascinating.
A pressure on his skin. Was she pulling the teeth out or poking the skin around them? He couldn't tell. He couldn't look.
To have this many broken off with such uniform spacing would require an application of force at a sheer angle, and a lot of resistance. Your body is remarkably tough.
Wait, what? That didn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, not really. For a Goron I'm considered pretty, wimpy. I find that difficult to believe. Anyone who can stand up to these monsters for as long as you did is remarkably resilient. That's not really me, though. Lord Dark was my ancestor, and I inherited Dark's protection from him. That's really all I have to my name. Bluto's always telling me that I need to be more like Lord Dark, Guru, or at least try to be, but I never seem to be able to do anything the way he would have. I just don't have. Whatever he had. I think I'd be disappointed in me.
Why was he being so open about all of this? A soothing coolness spread over his arm, cooler but also more pleasant than fresh water. That coolness made him feel calm. Everything he'd been thinking about Lord Dark, and Bluto, and the Lizalfos all started to recede, not disappearing but becoming less distinct. He felt lighter.
Well, wow, that's really nice. Thorough.
Without even thinking about it, he opened his eyes and looked at his arm, saw that Zelda's hands were awash in a pale blue light that seemed to feed that coolness, that calmness, directly into him. More, his wounds were gone.
How are you doing that? This is a healing technique that I learned from Azora Princess.
Behind the helmet, Zelda's smile was sad. Why was she sad? Her being sad was making his eyes sting. He couldn't tear up in front of her. He'd already embarrassed himself enough today.
Here, give me your other arm, too. Good. This one might take a moment longer, though. Buddha mentioned you were here looking for his medicine. Yeah, I was. Ludo used to be head of the mining operations, and his medicine for his back was always kept in storehouses at the Northern and Summit mines. We had to evacuate both so fast that we didn't manage to take his medicine with us, so he's been going out for a long time, Goro, and he's really hurting. I was trying to get to the Northern storehouse, but, well, you saw. And if I don't get Bluter his medicine, we won't be able to drive off Varudornia next time it comes around. Alright?
He wanted to panic. He realized he was leaning into that mood like a defense mechanism. The coolness of the Zora healing technique wouldn't really let him, though, so instead he found himself wondering why he was trying to panic. That didn't make a lot of sense, did it?
Is that the storehouse? To the north.
It was the first time he'd heard Pae's voice, and it took him aback, high but smooth, projecting a depth of calm that he didn't know if he'd ever heard before. Why he liked her voice.
Why yeah, there used to be bridges connecting all the islands, but between the monsters and all the earthquakes they've all been destroyed. Goro. Zelda, there are vents between most of the islands which are blowing out updrafts. We might be able to use our paragliders to cross between them.
She was looking at everything and taking it all in at once, addressing the problem like it wasn't even really a problem, more like it was just a room she had to maneuver through.
I'll defer to you. Inobo, can you climb? Why yeah. I may not be able to do much because I am so scrawny, but I'm a good climber. Go. I was planning to just wade between the islands and climb the rocks after.
It would have been warm, but he'd probably be able to take the heat long enough to get the medicine and get back without being scalded. Something in that must have struck them, because both Zelda and Paia looked at his face, and he could feel his color rising.
Why you know. If I had made it.
Zelda lifted her hands from his arm, patting it once, and he lifted it off her shoulder, holding it up, turning it, inspecting it. He did the same with the other arm. There wasn't a sign that he'd been in a fight at all. Hylians who took lessons from Zora had strong healing. Maybe he should ask her to look at the boss's back.
Would you be willing to accept our help, Inobo? There are monsters in the way, still, and I noticed what looks like cannons on several of the outcroppings in the lava. I think that if you showed us how to operate them, we might be able to render assistance in retrieving Bluto's medicine.
He looked back and forth between them. One regarded him with a warm smile and the other with a calm, measured appraisal that assumed nothing even as it observed everything. Something important was going on here, if the boss had seen fit to ask two Hylians to help out. Inobo might not be able to understand much, but he understood that, and he understood that having them look to him, having the opportunity to work with them, set a fire in his chest. The Lizalfos milled about on the small spaces they had been set to guard, the wide set of their independently tracking eyes giving each of them an enormous current of awareness. They could not see far, but within the dozens of meters where their vision was clear almost nothing would escape their attention. Any other subspecies of Lizalfos would have burned to death simply standing in the air of Death Mountain, much less above the exposed lava that had bubbled up from beneath the abandoned northern mine. These, though, were fire Lizalfos, who held flames in their guts, who could spark conflagrations with their breath. Short of the molten stone that roiled and glowed beneath them, no degree of heat was so terrible that they could not endure it. Their weapons were constructed to the same end, but they appeared to be reinforced with bone. That was a trick of their metallurgy. No bone save their own, or, perhaps, Goron's, would last long in this heat. The days were long and monotonous, and the Lizalfos of the northern mine betrayed their true origins in that they did not sleep. They were given perfectly to that single purpose, to guard, to watch, without breaking the monotony through rest or repast. What changes did come came invariably from without, and it had been some time since the Gorons were so brave as to push against them. So, When the monotony broke, in fire and light and the color blue, it came as a surprise to them. One sentry saw a flash of movement in the distance, but its vision was not so clear that it could be sure anything. A blur the color of fire and stone, another blur of somewhat lighter hue, and a third that for all the world looked like a rock rolling across the lava before climbing a cliff face. The sentry stood at its full height, craned its neck back and forth, taking in the scene with both of its eyes, but could not make anything of it. Movement, yes, and there shouldn't have been movement, but it could not be sure of what it was looking at. It did not patrol, it merely watched, that was its purpose, and so it did not pursue this strange phenomenon. Its hearing was sharper than its eyes, though not by much, so when the voices of those blurs were raised in questions about the operation of the cannon, it could not discern what was being said. The Zalfos, like bokoblins, had their own language, and each spoke the language of the other, and all could understand Hylian when they so chose, but the sounds of the mountain were too strong, the voices too faint. A blur of blue light, the sound of a hammer ringing on iron. The other sentry on the outcropping looked up then, Chewie, joining its fellow in craning, and listening, and trying to understand. Then there was a flash of blue, and the cannon fired, and they did not have time to react before a flaming, explosive projectile fell upon them. The impact, to say nothing of the eruption that followed it, sent them flying, lifeless, their bodies dropping into the exposed lava as quickly and as smoothly as if it were water. The sounds of the mountain continued, and the other sentry stations did not raise the alarm. They were spaced far enough apart that it was difficult for each to see its neighbor, and the eruption of the cannon was not far removed from the roiling of the mountain's blood. So it went. The creatures of Ganon saw the interlopers, these invaders of the invaders. Only rarely and briefly one pair was close enough to a cannon that they recognized the threat, that they had no horn with which to warn the other sentries. They loose fire arrows in an endless hail, but each projectile burst and sputtered and died against the crystalline light of the champion's power. They did not understand, quite, what they were seeing. They did not have time to wonder. The cannon fired. Bit by bit the sentries were removed, a platform shattered. A tiny fortress rent to splinters that burned in the air almost as soon as it split. A dozen explosions punctuated by high, predatory screams. Red tails were shed in a defensive reflex that did nothing to protect their owners, and these were collected by the princess, who wondered at their properties. This was not a long-term solution. All three of them knew that if the Lizalfos were slain here then they would only appear here again when the earth bled. To drive them out fully would require forcing them away from the mine while they still lived, perhaps by driving them further up the mountain where the climate might take care of them on its own. This was only temporary, but that did not stop the three. They came to the supply house, which was blocked off by a collapsing stone, knocked loose by Death Mountain's restlessness. They blasted it clear, and retrieved the medicine, and left that place together, two carried by the wind and one stepping lightly through the glowing magma. Yunobo wanted to cheer, but he did not. If he did, then his companions might think less of him, after all.
I'm sorry, these aren't really suited to the task.
Pai's apology was tinged with disappointment. The shears in her hands were heavy, not delicate like she would have preferred. The inn's owner had not had any other scissors handy, had in fact handed over his own personal pay to the two guests when they checked into their room.
I guess the Gorons don't really have the same considerations when cutting their hair. I'm sure it will be fine, I trust you. Even if it's not. Hair grows back.
Zelda spent a second to wonder at her own hair. Actually, she had been a princess once, and doubtless she'd been assisted in the care of her hair by other people. Still, she remembered what it had been like in the time before, how it had felt, and knew that she must have taken some pride in it. She didn't feel that now.
In fact, we could skip past worrying about it. You could give me a short style. Like a page cut. Or perhaps even shorter. I will of course cut your hair however you please, Princess.
Never mind the fact that she'd called her princess again. Pai's hands were audibly shaking and so was her voice. Yes, she'd definitely chop off all of Zelda's hair fast, but she'd be blinded by tears while doing it.
Or you could just trim the burnt ends a little, and we'll tend to the finer shaping later.
Pai sighed in relief behind her, a sigh that was cut off halfway through, as if she'd just caught herself doing it.
As you wish. I will try and determine the extent of the damage.
Zelda could not feel her hair, precisely, but she could feel Paia, her presence and her proximity. It was probably the effect of the goddess's power saturating her awareness. or possibly of her memory returning, or maybe even the small amount that Paya still held inside of her, regardless of the reason. She could more than see the care and tenderness with which she took Zelda's hair in her hands, running her fingertips down the length of a collection of strands. Something in the other woman's motions was not affectionate, exactly. More than affectionate, really. Reverent? I must get my mind away from these avenues because it is not fair. She doesn't know I can sense her, but also I can't tell her.
I can't imagine it's too bad. My head was only exposed for a few moments, wasn't it? A few moments.
Paya's voice not at all betraying her flinch.
Yes. It mostly seems to be damage at the tips. I will do my best to make this as even as possible, but it will take time and I am not working with perfect tools.
Of course. Forefinger and middle finger with hair laid across them, thumb holding a golden lock in place against them. She could feel it as Paya fought the urge to rub the hair between her fingers. Zelda closed her eyes, tried to think of something else. Was she holding the goddess power? She was. She'd been holding it since she had recovered her memory. She hadn't even realized it. She let go, and her senses fell completely back into her own head, and she breathed relief just as the shears cut through for the first time. Tnet. What a relief. To know her hair was being cut only from the sound of it, knowing what lock was being held from the faint pressure on her scalp. She hadn't meant to do that, but it was still an invasion, wasn't it? Paya wouldn't see it that way. In her mind, Zelda was only just removed from being a god, and these things were expected of her, but... Tnet. Metal on metal, with hair between. Good shears, if oversized. Sure, steady hands. Regardless of how much Paya's heart must have been racing. Oh, she was doing wrong even in this. Surely their closest hurt Paya, too. Thus she told Paya she could not respond to her feelings did not mean that Paya was insulated from the effects of being near to her. She was being cruel in this. But how much crueler would it be to suggest anything else? Tnet. Metal on metal. Zelda thought of the sound of Paya fighting, her weapon clashing with those of the Yiga. She'd heard that sound so clearly when she rose up from the darkness, lifted out of death by Miva's grace, even over the sound of the power and the name of the dragon. She'd heard it so clearly, even after she died. Tnet.
Aya. I know it seems meaningless, but I'm sorry.
She could feel Paya about to ask why, so she pressed on.
Roller, you were trying to protect me, and you warned me how dangerous that person was, and... everything that happened after that was because I didn't listen to you enough. I'm not even sorry that I stepped near to him.
If she had, she couldn't remember. The moment was lost to her in the roar of the bombs going off.
But I'm sorry you had to see me like that. That I scared you so badly.
Tnet. Paya went on cutting, even as she talked.
It was upsetting. Seeing you in the air like that, wreathed in smoke, and I couldn't see your face until you hit the ground.
She paused, plainly considering her next words.
I wasn't thinking about Ganon, then, about what would happen if you died. Just about you. I was afraid of what it would be like to have to gather you up, after, to carry you, to look at your face.
Zelda wanted to reach over her shoulder, to offer a hand in comfort or sympathy, but she could not. Paya had not stopped cutting. She thought about saying she was sorry again, though it would sound ridiculous, and so said nothing for half a minute. Then, once it had been long enough that she was sure Paya would not try to fill the silence herself.
Do you want to talk about it? Not yet. Please give me a little more time. Ah. Yes, please forgive me.
She had not meant that, but well enough. It might serve as a good segue.
Bluto said that Vorudonia would pass around the side of the mountain in the early morning. I will be sure that both of us are ready for it.
As ready as they could be, Zelda thought. Silence. Then, long minutes of silence as Paya cut delicately at the burned tips of Zelda's hair. It was slow going, not just due to the unwieldiness of the shears, but also because every time Paya cut she took the time to lift away the severed length and set it gently aside. She was slowly forming a bit of a pile. Zelda could see out of the corner of her eye. What did one do with discarded hair? Anime? Treat it like floor sweepings, she would think, but somehow she didn't imagine Paya would be enthusiastic about that option. Still,
I can't help but notice,
and Zelda hoped she was not being rude with this, that you are more comfortable
around the Gorons than I would have anticipated.
Another silence as Pia mulled over that.
Do you remember how Bluto greeted us? And Crane, at the gate? And the shopkeeper?
And perhaps a dozen others that she could have named but didn't.
They all called us brother. Yes, because that is how they saw us. Gorons are uniformly men, but they are not quite equivalent to the Gerudo. There are no Goron who identify as women. They're monogendered.
Zelda's mind was suddenly racing. If that were true, why did they identify as men in particular? Why was masculinity the default?
Has it always been that way? Goron historians actually think that the idea of masculinity, of gender, is something that they might have picked up after encountering the other peoples of Hyrule. The things that Gorons value culturally, strength, stolidity, boisterousness, a big appetite, were masculine coded. Or, at least, that's one of the theories.
A larger cut this time, slow and meticulous.
They don't see others as being feminine or apart from that binary, ever. Everyone and everything is simply more masculine or less masculine, and to them all Hylians, Sheikah, Sora, and Rita look various degrees less masculine than Gorons.
Shifting away from the question of culturally conferred and encoded gender felt like code switching between Hylian and Gerudo languages, and Zelda's thoughts nearly stumbled as she shifted back to thinking of this from Pia's perspective.
So, you saying that? It's not that you're reacting to them differently than you would other men, precisely. It's that when they look at you, they see someone like them, more or less, and you don't feel that same pressure. I think that's close.
Pia's agreement was tinged with sadness? Why was that? Before she could turn and ask, Pia set the shears on the nightstand.
Finished.
Zelda ran her fingers along the length of her hair, grasping at the tips, and finding that they were almost precisely the same length they had been before Pia started cutting. The pile of cuttings Pia had gathered was very fine, and for how thick Zelda's hair was that was saying something.
Is that all? I thought you would have to take off more. I only cut off the burned ends, but I promise that I have left nothing behind. I must not have been exposed to the heat of Death Mountain for very long.
She smiled, genuinely happy for this thing that should have been small.
It will be good not to smell of burnt hair. Thank you, Pia.
The color leapt into Pia's face and she bowed, trying to say something, and failing utterly to do more than mumble.
Will you help me braid it? In the morning, I mean. It will make it so much easier to wear the helmet. Of course, Zelda.
Word had been delivered that Yunobo had gotten Bluto's medicine to him, and both were taking their rest. Zelda and Pia ate their dinner, Goron curry, prepared by the proprietors, and applied fireproof elixirs to their skin. When the owner offered to give them a massage, they declined, and took to their beds. Zelda was asleep in less than a minute, the exhaustions of the day telling on her again. Pia sat up for a while longer. For nearly an hour she did not write, or read, or even watch the entrance to the inn. She simply sat up in bed and looked at Zelda. Made sure she was still there. Made sure that she was still real. After that hour she rose from bed and took the small pile of trimmings in her hands. She was as good as her word, and there was nearly no gold in the darkened, twisted strands of cut hair, but in the light of the inn one could catch glimmers of that same brilliance when one looked at it. Quietly, so she would not be heard by the innkeeper or disturb Zelda, Pia stepped outside, into the open air of Goron City. She looked around, ensuring that no one was watching, and no one was, at this time of night, then walked over to one of the metal bridges that spanned the gap between the aisles of solid ground that made up the city. Standing at the edge of the bridge she looked down, into the roiling magma that was the heart of Death Mountain. She held her cup hands out, whispered a prayer, and opened them.
Keep us safe.
Zelda's hair flared as it fell, twisting into cinders and blowing and making her think of the elemental opposite of snowfall. There was no smell, save for the heavier smell of the mountain. She stood there, watching long after the light had gone out, waiting until she thought that whatever elemental particles were left might have settled on top of the glowing stone that flowed below. She went back. Zelda had rolled over in her sleep, lying on her side so that she was facing Pia's bed. Her expression was different when she slept. There was no stress, no worry creasing her brow or pressure weighing down the sides of her mouth, but she also looked the same. Pia looked away from her. She got back into bed, took out her journal, and began to write. 4 hours before they would rise, she put the journal back into her pack, said another prayer, this time to Hylia, and lay down in truth. She fell asleep even faster than Zilda had. End of chapter.